So, yeah, as Yancey mentioned, this has been a great series for me. It's been great for all of us, I think, but it's also been challenging. We've been really looking at some tough questions, a lot of memes criticizing and poking holes in the Bible and Christianity and the absurdity of it. And we've been trying to address it from a rational basis as well as look at it from what the actually Bible says about some of those objections. And it's really important that Christians, listen and honor the questions that we have as friends, neighbors, family members, really serious questions. And maybe it helps us to question and maybe to articulate our faith. And as Peter said, as we said in the first week of this series, Peter always challenged us to say, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. That Christianity isn't a kind of faith or system or philosophy where God asks us to check our mind at the door, but instead it's based on historical events, and it's important that we understand the questions and the concerns and also look at it from what the Bible has been talking about. And so this has been a great week for me because I got to go back to high school. I haven't studied biology and evolution and physics. I kind of quit physics in grade 12 because I realized that was made for smart people, and that's not my brain. So I think Rogerio's got a physics background. Anyone else study physics? Like one or two hands. Okay, so want to talk, as Yancey said, the question on the table today is science compatible with Christianity? Is science compatible with the Bible? And partially to answer that question, back in 1974 in West Virginia, there was a really hostile incident going on. In fact, a reporter was sent from Chicago to catalog what was happening. And what was happening was that the people of this small village or the small town in West Virginia were burning books, banning and kind of closing the schools, and actually throwing pipe bombs into the school, because in their idea and their understanding, what was being taught to their kids was anti-Christian, anti-Bible. And so the pastor of this town was kind of riling people up and getting them to burn books or ban books and to question the education. And a lot of it had to do with evolution, but even other books like Lord of the Flies and some of the fictional books that we've all studied in elementary school and high school, there's all these different ideas, and parents were concerned that if they read these books and if they ingested these ideas, that they would be hard to control at home. They would be the kind of kids that would go off and do crazy things. And it was all based on fear that the world was leaving them behind, fear that science had somehow erased God, and there was a lot of intense emotions associated with that. And so the only thing that they knew to do was, again, to lock the schools, ban the books, and in some cases to burn the books. And that small story illustrates why I think there's so much tension, even today, between science and Christianity. Back in the 1800s, in about 1858, Charles Darwin, he authored the book Origin of the Species. And that was, to say that was a landmark book and a landmark idea and thesis is to state the obvious, because it has changed so much in the last 150 years. And so is the Bible anti-science? Is it the science textbooks, astronomy and physics and chemistry and evolutionary biology, is that quote-unquote hard science and hard data? And is Christianity and religion kind of on the softer side? It's more about philosophy and nice ideas and myths. But when we want to trust something, when we want to have evidence, we turn to the sciences. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of how people think about it today, that sciences are hard, they're verifiable, and the Bible is on the other side, which is, it's nice and it can help you, and it's about love and good ideas, but not something to take seriously. And I think that one of the problems, before I go into some of the explanations for what we're going to talk about today, I think one of the biggest problems today in the church, I'm talking to us and pastors and those of us that assemble in places like this all around the world, is that many of us have a system of theology, which is to say, it's not just about Jesus, but it's everything, and we're kind of given this package. And so the Christian package is something like this, that we have the 6-day creation account. It's a literal 24 hours. It's 6 days. And then there's the flood story, exactly as the Bible depicts. And then there's the verifiable flood data and the account of Moses, the account of David, and on and on and on. And all these different things get kind of stacked together. And the idea is if any one of these things gets proven false, if evidence comes out that it wasn't a six-day creation account, if there's evidence about astronomy or molecular biology or other things that gets happen, what happens when you stack it on these different foundations? If everything's together and one thing gets pulled apart, what happens? It's like a house of cards that collapses. And I think the biggest problem today is that we've kind of created a system where all of these things have to necessarily be true. And if you pull one thing from the deck, it kind of helps you think, well, maybe I can't trust the Bible for anything. And so before I go into the science talk, let me just say it this way. The reason why Christianity is true has nothing to do with science and evolution or creation. The reason why Christianity is true has nothing to do with Moses and the Red Sea. The reason why Christianity stands the test of time is because of one historical event, the resurrection. If it's not for the resurrection, Paul put it this way: let's eat, drink, and be merry, or to put it in today's vernacular, let's get stoned, because if Christ has not risen from the dead, let's party, let's get stoned, because there's nothing to live for. And so Christianity rises and falls on the event of the resurrection of Jesus, not on a literal six-day creation account, not on the understanding of the flood account. And we can debate and talk about those things because they're interesting, and there's lots of what we want to say about those things. But before I go further, it's important for us to not build our foundation upon things that are not necessarily tethered to the veracity, the truthfulness of Christianity. Because if you pull one card out of that deck, everything falls. It's a house of cards. And so let me go on and talk a little bit about Charles Darwin. I have a picture on the screen behind me. So Charles Darwin authored Origin of the Species in 1859. Obviously, Darwinism and scientific naturalism comes from this idea. It's, of course, proponents, many people after that and before that. But it's the idea that naturalism is that physical matter is all that there is. There's no need for God. There's no need for other things, because that Darwin tried to prove in his research and in his book that there was no God. There was just this natural system of natural selection and survival of the fittest, and basically things just evolved from one species to another, more and more complex, reducing and eliminating the need for God. And so the first component that we have to talk about when we come to the account of Genesis is we have to understand that in today's modern day language, that even for the last 150 years, evolution has been the number one theory as young as grade 3 and grade 4, all the way through high school and university. And even though a lot has changed since 1859, there's so much of the foundation of Darwinism still being taught and still being espoused in the sciences today. And here's what I want to talk about: the effect of Charles Darwin as we understand the world today, and how it is that we come to and compare and contrast Genesis with our understanding, because we all live in a culture. And as much as we want to be unbiased, we can't be unbiased, because we've been raised on Darwinism. We've been raised in evolutionary theory. We've been raised with these ideas and these suppositions, and it makes us really nervous, kind of like the people in West Virginia. Like, how do we reconcile Genesis with Darwinism and evolutionary theory and creationism? And those are really important questions. And so it helps you to understand the effects and really the atomic bomb in a lot of ways of his thoughts and how far-reaching his theory was. Let me just quote George Gaylord Simpson. It's a great name, an evolutionary biologist. And this is him summing up what Darwin was trying to prove. Man is the result, listen to this, of a purposeless and a natural process that did not have man in mind. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. In other words, Darwinism and evolutionary theory was the idea that you don't need God. In fact, science or matter proves that it was a natural process that just evolved through natural selection, survival of the fittest, and that had nothing to do with the value of man. In fact, man was just a lucky coincidence. Why is there man today? Well, it's because of luck. It's because of chance. It's because of billions and billions of years and billions of probability that somehow that the conditions for life existed. So the effects of this, of course, and you contrast this to before 1800s, the idea that creationism was really the science that was being studied and taught in schools, and you slip over to 1859 and everything changed. Philip Johnson, who authored a book called Darwin on Trial, an incredible biologist and philosopher critiquing Darwin, said this: "The whole point of Darwinism is to show that there is no need for a supernatural creator because nature can do the creating by itself." So again, Darwin was the idea that the process was the process. It eliminated God because by evolutionary theory, by natural selection, that there was no need. It eliminated God from the conversation. And as late as 1999 in Time magazine, on its last issue of the year of 1999, under their category called Iconoclast of the Century, I had to look up what the word iconoclast was. Again, I had to do a lot of research this week. Do you know what the word iconoclast means? It means somebody that destroys categories or destroys sacred beliefs. And so this is what they said. Time magazine said about Darwin. Charles Darwin didn't want to murder God, as he once put it, but he did. And so we just think, this is just a result of evidence and study. But the effects of Darwinism are so profound across all cultures. Most cultures of the world today that would study science and have textbooks would have elements of Darwinism even hundreds and 150 years later. And it really did, in a lot of ways, end the conversation. Can God and science coexist? Well, for those that are proponents of Darwinism, they would say no. Darwin proved and evolutionary biology proved that there is no need for God. And so as we come to the Genesis story, it's important for us to first understand the culture that we live in here in Montreal, in McGill, in Concordia, in CEGEP, in high school biology. The idea of evolution is so everywhere. I lost my word, but it's being taught. It's the culture of the students. It's just what we think about. It's what we assume. And so it's very hard for us to then take that understanding and put it over Genesis and think anything else. So I wanted to start with the modern understanding of matter, that scientific naturalism, that matter's all there is the starting point. But as we go to the Genesis story, I want to also talk about this for a moment, that one of the laws, or one of the laws we talked about in the first week of the series was this, if you remember this, that the Bible was written for you, but not to you. One of the laws to interpreting the Bible correctly, how to read the Bible, also how not to read the Bible, is this important law, that remember that the Bible is not just one book, it's 66 books. Remember all these things. Don't ever just read one verse. Read the paragraph, read the book, read the whole story. And then an important thing when we come to Genesis is to understand that the Bible, although it's a gift from God, it's what God wants us to know. Ultimately, however, it wasn't written to us directly, and we know that because in particular in the Genesis account, it was written in around 1400 BC, and it was authored in Hebrew. Now, I get to study Hebrew. How many other people have studied Hebrew before? Not very well. Okay, so it's a tough language. And so it was written to Hebrews around 3,400 years ago. And so it was written to them in a specific reason, a specific context. Of course, we can understand it, but it takes a lot of time and effort for us to understand that. And it's important to understand this, that the Hebrews, the pre-Israelites, all the nations around them at this same time in history, around 1400 BC, all of the nations, and in particular Egypt, where they were slaves, they had creation stories. Did you know that? All of these other nations had what we call creation myths, ideas of how it is that something came out of nothing, how there was chaos that came into order. And I just wanted to summarize this really briefly, that the neighbors of Israel had their own creation stories. Egypt, Babylon, Mesopotamia, all had three different accounts of answering the question, who are we? Why do we exist? Why are there mountains? Why is there water? Fundamental questions that really haven't changed. That we ask the same questions. Why am I here? Is there a God? What's the meaning to life? What's the purpose of life? What's my destiny in eternity? Is there a life after death or not? All these fundamental questions that philosophers and you and I continue to wrestle with have been the questions of time. And so with limited scientific knowledge and without telescopes and microscopes, again, 3,500 years ago, Egypt, Babylon, Mesopotamia, and the Hebrews had their own creation stories. Now, here's what's in common. I want to tell you what's in common with all of these three different neighbors, the Egyptians, Babylonians, and the Mesopotamians, surrounding nations of Israel. What was in common was that each of these nations talked about a formless universe. It was void. It was like a wasteland. There was nothing good there, nothing that could sustain life. Okay, so that was what's in common. They talked about chaos and something emerging from chaos. All of them had different deities to describe how something came out of nothing. That each one of them had their own gods and goddesses coming, in some cases, into war to bring creation into existence. And so there was darkness, there was waters in all these stories, there was chaos there, and there was chaos emerging through gods and goddesses. So in each one of these cases, all of these have in common parts of the creation story. And we see that very same thing happen in the Genesis account. Now, let me talk about some of the differences. In particular, the differences of the Hebrew story, the Genesis story, and these other stories. In every one of these other neighbors, they describe a polytheistic, in other words, gods and goddesses. And in Egypt in particular, there was the god of the sun. There was the god of the Nile River, the god of mountains, the god of fertility, gods and goddesses everywhere. And in the creation story in Egypt in particular, they had to go to war together. In almost every one of their accounts, the way that creation happened is that gods and goddesses came to war together, killed each other, and the bloody parts were sent to other corners of the universe. And out of those bloody parts, that's how man was created. So it was gods and goddesses going to war. It was a bloodbath. It was sort of extremely violent. And here's what's interesting. In each one of these neighborhood accounts of the creation story, man is an afterthought. The gods and the goddesses are the centerpiece of the creation story. And it's just like, well, man gets created. And in some cases, they're created to do menial labor for the gods, right? To bring water to the gods or to bring harvest to the gods. It's sort of like they're an afterthought of the creation story. So I wanted to say all those things because as we read Genesis 1 together, I want us to think about this. Why was Genesis 1 and 2 written? What was the occasion? Genesis was written, again, to Hebrews. And in particular, it was given to them in the wilderness right after they came out of Egypt. They were slaves for 430 years in the most dominant empire of its day, Egypt. And so what were Hebrews wondering? What were the questions that they were asking? Who is God? Am I going to be safe in the wilderness? Is the Egyptian account of the creation story true where there's gods and goddesses going to war? Are we just here to serve the gods? Am I going to be safe? What's my destiny? Is there a God that's going to look after us? And if you want me to really blow your hair back, do you know the 10 plague story in Egypt, in the story of Exodus? You know that story? Remember how God brought, he had the frogs and the hail, and he turned the Nile into blood? Remember that story? Here's what's going to blow your hair back. All 10 of those plagues were systematically taking down gods of Egypt. God was saying in the account, he's not just talking about a children's story. Oh, there's frogs coming and there's hail coming. Every single one of those plagues was attacking a god of Egypt. There were gods of frogs. The Nile was considered a divine entity. All the different things, all the different plagues. Go back and study it this afternoon. We don't have enough time. But what God was doing through that account is systematically taking down the gods and goddesses of Egypt, showing what? There is only one God. And this God is the most powerful God. Again, slaves that had no power, no status, the God of Israel steps into the scene where all this is going on, and he takes them out one after the other, so much so that all of the wealth, all the gold and the silver, Egypt can't send them out with enough wealth. Like, it's ridiculous. They just say, hey, take my gold, take my Swarovski crystal, take all of this, take my Christian Louis Vuitton shoes, take my Prada, take everything. They can't bless them enough because they're so fearful of what God has been doing to Egypt. So in the 1400 BC, 400 years after being enslaved in Egypt, why did Moses compose Genesis? He was trying to answer the question, who is God? Who are we? Where are we going? And how do we please God? Basic questions. Were they concerned about evolutionary theory in 1400 BC? Did they know about carbon dating, artificial intelligence? Did they know about the galaxies of the world, the Hubble telescope? Yes or no? Thank you. Yeah. I don't want but here's where, because when we read Genesis, we're thinking about all those things. We're asking the question, how? I know about the Hubble telescope. I know about evolutionary theory. I know about Darwin. I know about DNA and RNA. I know about all these things. And my question, I've been trained as a science student, even as a bad science student, to ask the question, how? And so we can't help but read Genesis with the question, how? You know what the question of Genesis is answering? Who? It's not the how. Of course, there's some of that in there, but this is a pre-scientific. Well, it's always been scientific, but in our modern vernacular, it's not trying to answer about evolutionary theory. It's not trying to interact with Darwinism. It's not trying to interact with DNA and RNA and the billions and billions of stars in the galaxy. It's bringing it down to the Bible was written for them, for their specific context, for their specific questions that, of course, apply to us today. And so with all that being said, that's the preamble of today's talk. Okay, Genesis chapter 1. So we're setting up, again, that there's the modern naturalist view, that there matters all that there is. That's the modern scientific view. The second thing we did is we talked about a tour of the gods and the goddesses of surrounding nations and the creation stories, okay? And now we're going to read Genesis. We're going to try to take all of that off, take all the evolutionary biology, all the astronomy, all the astrology stuff away so that we can actually read the text as God intended. And that's really tough. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now listen to this. Now the earth was what? Formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the what? The deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Genesis and Moses is interacting with the Babylonian account. He's interacting with the Egyptian account. He's interacting with the other Mesopotamian neighbors about their creation story. There's chaos, there's darkness, there's waters, and there's a God. But in our account, there's one God, and he's hovering over the waters. And the same Hebrew language is like a hen hovering over her chicks. It's an intimate, it's a personal account of what God's doing. He's bringing meaning, he's bringing purpose, he's bringing protection. But notice, in Genesis 1 already, Moses in Genesis is interacting with his neighbors. He's saying that there's a formless world, there's a void world, there's a chaotic world. And God is bringing order from the chaos. Continuing on in verse 3, and God said, let there be light. I wish I had a Morgan Freeman voice right now. Let there be light. And there was light. And if you read, we're not going to read all of Genesis 1 because we'd be here for several hours and you'd be sweating by the end because it's hot in here. Okay, so I'm not going to do that, but I just want you to go back later on this afternoon and read those first 15, 20 verses. And what you're going to see is that there's a pattern. It's going to say, and God said, every single time. And God said. And then it's, let there be. And there was. And at the end it says, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, and God said, and God said, and there was. And if you've read Genesis, I'm sure you have before, because you're good City Church people, right? You're going to see symmetry. And what many theologians believe about Genesis 1 is that this is an evidence of Hebrew poetry. It's using a very specific genre of literature. It's got parallelism. It's got symmetry between it. And I got Nicholas here. She's an English professor, so she appreciates that, right? If you see it, if you can't help, even if you don't know Hebrew, you see it in English. And God said, let there be, and there was. And there was evening, and there was morning the next day. And so we read that, and we think, well, how, God? Did you use evolution? Did you use a Big Bang? Did you use DNA and RNA? I mean, what was in that primordial soup anyways? What was the amino acid? What was all that stuff that created the life that there is today? And again, we have to understand that this is written around 1400 BC with very different questions, without all of that stuff going in their heads. And God was answering different questions. So let there be light. There was light. God saw the light. It was good. He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. I want to show this chart next. And what you're going to see, again, in the parallelism, in the poetry of the Hebrew reading is this. In days 1 through 3, God is forming. Remember, Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Babylonians, they talked about a chaotic world, a formless world, a world without anything. And so in days 1 through 3, what is God doing? He's forming. He's creating a container. He's creating for something to exist. You have to have a container. You have to create space for something before you can fill it. And so, for example, in days 1 through 3, God forms light. He forms the skies and the seas. And then he forms dry land. And then if you look at days 4 through 6, what is he doing? He takes what is formed and he fills them. He fills them with purpose. He creates light, and so he fills the sky with sun and moon and stars. He fills the light form with all of those incredible entities. He takes what is formed with the sky and the sea, and what does he do? He fills the waters with beautiful dolphins and beautiful fish and beautiful animals on the sea. He fills the sky with birds, eagles, and pigeons, and egrets, and go on from there. And then he takes what he's formed on the dry land, and what does he do? He fills it with beautiful animals, antelope, and jackalopes, and tigers, and elephants. And he fills it with humans. And so if you put all of that together, you see that God is very purposely in the Genesis account. He's showing that there is order being brought. He's forming something, and he's filling it. And it's all evidence of God creating something out of nothing. And what's different between the Hebrew account of Genesis, what we just read, and what the other accounts of their neighbors is that God is creating something out of nothing. That there was this God that was nothing before, and God brought everything into existence. He didn't need other gods and goddesses. That he just brought everything into existence from nothing. And then what makes Genesis really different, at the end of chapter 1, it says, in the image of God, God created them. In the image of God, God created them. The Imago Dei. Male and female, he created them. They were not the product of chance, as Charles Darwin would have proposed. They were not the product of chance as the gods and goddesses fought out and somehow the blood got spattered across the universe just so that these beings got created, these dirty, smelly, fleshly humans. That's what a lot of the accounts talk about. These humans are gross, they smell bad, which I can't disagree if you've been on a metro in Montreal in the summertime. But again, the account is so different. In Genesis 1, God talks about how they're made in the image of the very creator who brought something from nothing. And then at the end of the story in chapter 1, what does it say? God blessed them. And he said to be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. Rule over everything I've created. And the sense that you get is that man and woman is valuable. Intrinsically valuable. They are made in the very image of a creator who could bring something from nothing. And not just anything, but the beauty of the stars and the far-reaching heavens, that even in the primitive ideas of what they had back in those times, they understood the complexity, the beauty, the diversity of God's creation. And so it was a stark contrast between the creation stories of Egypt and what the Hebrews were experiencing. So just to summarize, as we think about what God was trying to communicate and what Moses was trying to communicate to these millions of people in the wilderness of Egypt. They had just left the capital. They've been walking around the wilderness for 40 years waiting for the promised land. And Moses gives them this account finally. And so they can compare and contrast all of the slavery stories, all the 400 years they've been hearing about their version of evolution, which is their version of Ra and their version of gods and goddesses. And for 430 years, grandparents passed it on to parents and parents passed it on to kids that they couldn't help. They were living in a counterculture much like we are today. Much like my kids on the front row are going to high school, and they're learning about all this evolutionary theory in the very same way. The Egyptians were indoctrinating the Hebrews in their creation myths and creation stories. And it was far different than what God intended them to know. And so what did Moses tell the Hebrews in summary? First of all, he corrected their understanding of God. God wasn't gods and goddesses. It wasn't many gods and many goddesses going to war that were violent. Instead, the God of Genesis is the one true God who had just vaporized the Egyptian gods. He is the one true God. Only one God was left standing. There was a battle royale in the 10 plague story, and only one God stood standing, and it wasn't the Egyptian God. Amen? But not just that. Not only was he the one true God that had just vaporized the Egyptian gods, but he was also the creator of the heavens and the earth. That the God that was being presented to them in the wilderness, that this God was the most powerful. He was the singular force of the universe. He was powerful. He didn't need any other help. He created everything, as we say, ex nihilo, out of nothing. So Moses and Genesis corrected their understanding of God. Secondly, who were the Hebrew people? They were slaves. They were people that didn't have an identity. And so this Genesis account corrected their understanding of themselves. What did God tell them in the wilderness? That you are made in my image. You are not the product of chance. You're not the product of evolutionary biology. You're the product of my intentional design. As we say at City Church a lot, that you were made on purpose for a purpose. So Genesis corrects the understanding that they're there randomly or because of the gods and goddesses going to war. Instead, they're created in the very image of God. And secondly, God says, you are my chosen people. What do you think that would do to a bunch of slaves? When everything that they do, going to the bathroom, getting up, going to bed, working 16, 18-hour days, they couldn't do anything on their own. And God gives them this gift to say, not only are you made in my image, but you are my chosen people, that I delight in you, and my power is behind you. And as they faced the Egyptians in the Red Sea, you might remember it, they were so fearful and terrified because this powerful army was coming after them. And God sent a pillar of fire to go in front of them and a cloud behind them to protect them. And God's power was personal. And his chosenness of his people was seen time after time, that the Passover story guaranteed that they were protected. And time after time and story after story in the book of Exodus, God showed himself worthy to be trusted. And then finally, the identity of the Hebrews. Not only were they made in God's image, not only were they the chosen people, but God gave them the blessing to be fruitful and to multiply. That they had the same gift that God had to bring life from nothing. And that as engineers, that as designers, as architects, as accountants, as singers, as pastors, as teachers, all of us have worth and value. We are called to cultivate and care for and bring order from the chaos. And I know Nicola understands that in the classroom at Sejep, that there is always chaos. And that's what Nicola is there for, to bring order from the chaos. And that when a musician sits down to write a song, they're bringing chaos into order, beauty from nothingness. And that's parents at home. There's chaos. Amen, moms and dads? And what we're doing as moms and as dads, what we're doing at home is we're bringing order from the chaos. When we see numbers on a spreadsheet, good accountants and tax attorneys, what are they doing? They're bringing order from the chaos. And so there's value in our work that only human beings are given the gift to bring and to rule over creation, to bring beauty from nothingness. So they were corrected about their image of God. They were corrected about who their identity was, who they were as people. And closely tied to that, their purpose was corrected. They were no longer slaves, but they were called to worship the only one true God. What the plague story did in Egypt is what reminded them is that not to put their trust in the sun and the moon and the waters and the Nile and the fertility gods that they were sacrificing to, as Egypt was doing that over and over again for 400 years. Israel got the idea that there's only one God, and he is to be feared. He is to be worshipped. And what one of my mentors from afar who just passed away this weekend, Tim Keller, says, he says that this account in Genesis is a shadow of the Ten Commandments. Because what God is doing, he's showing increasing complexity to the point where on day 6, man is created. But then, after day 6, it says God created the heavens and the earth. And the natural understanding is to say only God should be worshipped. The stars shouldn't be worshipped. The sun shouldn't be worshipped. The water shouldn't be worshipped. Animals shouldn't be worshipped. Other creation shouldn't be worshipped. Only God should be responded to because of his awesome power and because of his goodness. The last question that maybe is hanging in your heads is, so what do you think about evolution? And again, I think Genesis is not answering that question. Is that a cop-out? Genesis 1 is, if you actually look at Genesis 1 and 2 and you compare them side by side, many people believe that Genesis 1 is actually poetry and Genesis 2 is the historical account. That Genesis 1 is sort of showing up this symmetry, this parallelism, and is contradicting the stories of Egypt and contradicting the stories of Babylon and contradicting the stories of Mesopotamia. And Genesis 2 shows how things came into being in a systematic way. And so how do we see all that? Well, I think one way is we continue to advance in our science. And if God has called us to fill the earth and to rule over the fish and rule over the creation, it's interesting and kind of ironic in a way that the scientific revolution was born out of an understanding that God is powerful, that God is intricate, and that God is knowable. The whole Enlightenment, which was from 1500 to the 1800s approximately, was born out of the idea that God was powerful and incredibly intelligent in the design of the world. And not only that, but God was knowable. And so that's where science just exploded, because if they wanted to know God, they had to know the physics. If they wanted to know God, they had to know the astronomy. If they wanted to know God, they had to know the chemistry, the biology. And so the explosion of the sciences, ironically, started by a Judeo-Christian ethic that said that God was knowable. And so today we come to it and we think, well, science and God can't coexist. And yet, let me just say it to you this way. If you take a microscope, and this is where I get nervous because I'm getting right beyond my limits here as a scientist, okay? But if you take a microscope and you drill down on the subject, you see what? Incredible complexity. If you take the tiniest view of matter, the smallest matter that we can see, the cell, Darwinism and evolutionary theory said that at one point it was just a primordial soup, and if we could just get back to the early fossils, we would see that the cells were very primitive, in fact, hardly anything there. But as science has continued to develop, you know what they've discovered? The opposite is true. That there is DNA and RNA in each cell, and it is unbelievably complex. So on the smallest microscopic level, as you examine the creation of God, you see irreducible complexity. And then, if you take something opposite from a microscope, a telescope, and in particular the Hubble telescope, what do you find? At one point you thought, well, maybe there's 1,000 stars or 1,000,000 stars. And now, like, it makes my head hurt. I've read some of this stuff, like, I can't even get my head around it. I could ask Rogerio for this later as a physicist. But what they thought was that the universe was static, that the universe was not changing. But you know what they've discovered? Physicists, astrophysicists, astronomers have discovered the universe is expanding. It's not static. It's getting bigger. It's getting further and further away. And you know what the only inescapable conclusion of that is? Is there was a beginning. If the universe is expanding, and it's unmistakably expanding. Again, I'm getting way outside of my limits here. But there's red light wavelengths that are discovered through the telescopes. And what that shows is that they're getting further and further away. And what that tells you is that at some point they were together, and something caused something to expand. And what is that something? You can call it whatever you want, but Genesis says it's God, a powerful God. And so whether the earth is thousands of years or millions of years, I think the point is moot. Because what it tells us is that God was the intelligent designer behind it all. And whether you're looking at the smallest cell or you're looking at the far-reaching galaxies that we can't even begin to describe, it tells of an incredibly complex, incredibly well-thought, incredibly beautiful process. One thing before I close is, again, my head's getting hurt, even it's getting into knots as I'm talking about this. But physicists in particular talk about how complex the universe is. And if it is a Darwinism understanding, which is basically to say that we're just here by chance and natural selection, evolutionary theory, there are so many factors that have to be in balance for the universe to ever exist. For the gravity to be exactly 9.8 meters per second squared, to the exact component of helium, the exact component of how far the sun could be away from the earth without burning it up. And again, I was looking at it on a piece of paper, and I'm sorry that I'm not more scientifically, someone else could explain this a lot better, but the probability of all of those 12 or 13 factors having to be exactly the element that it is, the exact mathematical measurement that it is something like 1 to the 50th power. Like, it's billions and billions and billions and billions of a one chance. It's almost like it was described to me as like, let's pretend that there was 100 million, that's a lot of million, black balls in a jar, and you had to pick out the white one. There's one. And your life depended on it. Because in evolutionary theory, it's not just this idea that the universe existed, but that you existed as a person. And for all these complicated factors to be in tension, to be in balance, to allow the even existence of people, to allow an earth where there's oxygen and hydrogen, and all the things that we need for the survival of life, it would be like picking out one white ball with 100 billion black balls and doing it every time. Again, it's a lot to process on a Sunday morning. But all that to say that if you want to look at it, you can. And people will tell you that it is, even atheists and agnostics would have to acknowledge that the chances of our even being here is so remote that something must have made it happen. And of course, we have the gift of Moses' record to say, it's not a something, it's a someone. In Genesis, we see a God who is awesomely powerful, who said, let there be light. Just with his speaking of his voice, awesomely powerful. Again, he had just dismantled the most dominant empire systematically day after day, taking down the 10 gods of Egypt. A God who's awesomely powerful, but at the same time, lovingly personal. A God who's awesomely powerful and infinitely and lovingly personal. I want to close. I want to invite the band to come up now as we sing a song of response. I can't wait to see what song you guys chose for this message, Yancy. And maybe you're like me. Your head is in knots right now, and you still got questions, and that's okay. But again, what Genesis is not answering, it's not answering how old the earth is and how exactly did it take place. What Genesis is trying to answer is who? Who's responsible? And how does he compare with the gods of their neighbors? And what difference does it make that God has made me in his image? What difference does it make that God has called me to rule and to reign and to bring order from the chaos? I think Psalm chapter 8 captures it really well as we think about putting all these ideas together. And again, I want you just to close your eyes for a second. Just imagine with me. Imagine the most beautiful sunset you've seen. Imagine your favorite vacation spot. Maybe it's sitting on a beach and watching the endless expanse of the ocean in front of you. Maybe it's imagining how beautiful the sunrise looks over our city. Maybe it's the view from an airplane 30,000 feet above the sky, above the earth. And just have something in your mind. Maybe it's staring out at the skies at night and seeing all the stars and just wondering, God, how complex this creation is. Or maybe it is remembering what it looked like under a microscope to see the complexity of the small and the tiniest cell. The author of Psalm 8 says this, O Lord, your majestic name fills the earth. Your glory is higher than the heavens. You have taught children and infants to tell of your strength, silencing your enemies and all who oppose you. When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, what are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings that you should care for them. Yet, you made them not only a little lower than God, you crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority. The flocks and the herds and the wild animals, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, and everything that swims the ocean currents. And he finishes by saying this, O Lord, how majestic your name fills the earth. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that we can take time for heady, weighty subjects like this. And I know that even after today's talk, maybe it brings up more questions than answers. But I pray, Father, through your Spirit, that you would fill in the gaps where I was inadequate. And that you would just remind us, God, of all the things that we see, even in our city. The beauty of the ladybug, the complexity of what we see in the skies, God, the things that we've read about in science class or in literature, God, just the wonder of your creation. Father, I pray that you would show us even today, not only your power, but how lovingly personal you are. That you didn't just create the heavens and the earth, but you created us. That you care about our finances, you care about our sorrow. God, you care for us when we lose somebody. You care for us with our anxieties and our worries. And through the Lord Jesus, you are so personal that you provided your own son, that God, when we messed up, and we did it often, that your son Jesus showed us what it meant to sacrifice, and he gave his life so that we could have a relationship with this awesome God. So, Father, continue to stimulate our minds, and I pray that even today that we would resolve to do our work with the idea that we are bringing order from the chaos, that our work matters, our families matter, our actions matter. God, you have called us to reign and to rule and to bring beauty to our city, and so, God, help us to love our neighbors, help us to love our kids, help us to work hard at what you've given us with our hands, and so that we would reflect the very image of God. Thank you for the gift of this time together. I pray that you would help us to seal this time